Hi, Nathan.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
You know, never a dull moment in the AI game, that's for sure.
Or the world generally. And actually, we're going to talk about the intersection of the two. So, I'm really looking forward to this. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is the Nonzero podcast. You're Nathan Labenz, host of the highly regarded Cognitive Revolution podcast, which is one of my 3 go-to podcasts on AI. It's been very valuable for me. You're also founder of a company called Waymark that does video ads for small companies and employs AI in that process to make it cost effective for the companies in question. Let me, if you'll indulge me, give like the background story to this conversation. So a couple of weeks ago, I published in my Nonzero newsletter a story called AI Surrenders to the Military Industrial Complex. The news peg, as we used to say in journalism, was just that a couple of companies, Anthropic and Meta, had kind of crossed a line. They had decided that they were going to do business with the U.S. military, involving their large language models, and also involving Palantir, by the way, a well-known Silicon Valley defense contractor that had focused more on predictive than generative AI traditionally, but I'm sure it's open to all forms of Pentagon revenue. I DM'd you about the piece. I sent you the link, thought you might be interested in it. And I should say, the part of the story that I thought was most important actually was not the news, but kind of why some of it surprised people and why they shouldn't have been surprised. And I'm thinking in particular about Anthropic. As you know, Anthropic has a reputation for being particularly safety conscious, concerned about harms done by AI. And of course, the military is in the business of harming people. Now, I don't say that pejoratively. I grew up in a military family. I understand why countries need militaries. I actually have a lot of respect for the military as an institution. But I think this is one reason some people were surprised. I think they had maybe inferred from AI's safety consciousness that it was just kind of generally dovish or generally leftish or something. Anyway, there was surprise. Part of the point of my piece was they shouldn't have been surprised if they had been paying attention. Because Dario, can you help me pronounce his last name? I call him Dario as if I knew him, just so that I'll know I'm pronouncing it right. How does he pronounce his last name?
I believe it's Amadei.
Amadei. Who is a highly regarded figure in AI, not just because he founded Anthropic, which produces a great LLM called Claude, which I use, but because of his past role at OpenAI in developing the whole GPT technology. He's very highly regarded, and he had published this essay, I don't know, a couple of months ago now, I guess, called Machines of Loving Grace, 15,000 words. A lot of it was just laying out possible positive scenarios about the future use of AI. He had previously, I think, been thought of by some as kind of a negative guy, so concerned about risk. And so I think maybe he wanted to get out there, the fact that he's not blind to all the possible upsides if we avoid the catastrophic risks. But a part of the essay that didn't get nearly as much attention, I'm sure it got some in your circles, but for example, Lex Friedman did a 7,000-hour conversation with him, Dario, and didn't bring it up, even though it focused on the essay. And that was a part where what we would call in journalism the actual story from that document, like here's the news, where he lays out, I think more than he ever did, his foreign policy ideology as it applies to AI. And I would say, broadly speaking, he first of all signed on to a framing of U.S. foreign policy as common in the foreign policy establishment, certainly in the Biden administration, which is that the U.S. and other democracies are involved in an existential war with authoritarian or autocratic countries. I'm down on that framing myself, I should say, partly because I think it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But in any event, he was very straightforward about that. I'm not sure he mentioned China at all, but there's no doubt that he was talking about China and that he embraces the chip war that we have launched against China, which for reasons I will get around to explaining, I think is a bad idea. So anyway, I DM'd you. You replied with a link to some thoughts you had been developing on a Google Doc, and there was some convergence of our views. I'll leave it to you to characterize your views, but it's safe to say that neither of us is China hawks. And I think both of us worry a little about how rapidly China hawkism has become ascendant, not just in foreign policy circles, not just among national security types who are just learning about AI, but among a lot of AI types, including some who are just learning about national security. So I wanted to have you on to talk about this whole thing. It turns out you have in the meanwhile gone to this AI safety conference at Berkeley, where you participated in a war game, who's a futuristic one. I guess the premise is that there's AGI. Apparently, they didn't think highly enough of you for you to play the AGI, Nathan, but they found someone smarter.
Indeed.
But that I want to talk about that. But let me start out by asking, you report in the Google Doc recording your thoughts on the Berkeley conference that it's clear that China hawkism is dominant now. And I would like to start out by asking whether you have an explanation for the dynamics behind that. It was an interesting question to me 2 years ago before I was even thinking about AI, because it had started to happen in foreign policy circles. But what are your thoughts on the state of play there and how this came to be? And if you have theories about why, what those are?
That's a great question. I don't know if I have a great theory. I guess let me back up for 1 second and then I'll attempt it. First of all, I would recommend everyone read the Dario essay, and I might even do a full audio presentation of it on our feed in the not too distant future, because I think it really is kind of a study in contrasts between it is a pretty long essay, as you said. The first half is one of the best, if not maybe the best recent articulation of what is the upside of AI? Why should we be excited about this? Why should we not just pause AI now, or, to be even more vivid, strangle it in its crib, as Tucker Carlson once suggested. And, there's lots of good reasons. And he goes quite in depth. He's got a background in biology and biophysics and goes into his model of how biology and medicine improve and why we should expect that if AI gets good enough, we're going to get rapidly more discoveries. And he thinks that it's plausible that we could have what he calls a compressed century, where we get basically 100 years worth of biological and medical progress, not to mention, economic benefits and, equality globally within just a 5 to 10 year time frame. And I've honestly been crying for one of the AI lab leaders to say something like this, give us kind of something to hold on to for positive vision. So I really appreciated that. Notably, that section is a lot longer than the geopolitics section, which I do think kind of reflects the fact that at least the AI community is somewhat coming around to this late. And as much as I do think Dario is, a great thinker, he was, as you mentioned, one of the lead authors on the GPT-3 paper, one of the people along with Ilya who is credited as having understood the scaling dynamics very early when it was not at all the consensus view. It did have a little bit of a feel to me of kind of tech guy, thinks there's a simple solution to things that, might not actually have simple solutions. And just the brevity and the sort of, blithe kind of characterization of, okay, all these democracies will work together, will, have this advantage. AI is going to give us this advantage. We'll box everybody else. We'll isolate all of our adversaries. And then eventually they'll have no choice but to recognize that they should come onto our side and, take the deal, whatever the deal is. It's unclear what the deal is. Does the Chinese, regime survive this deal or not survive this deal?
And we should be clear. The deal happens when China kind of agrees to whatever conditions we lay down for relaxing the chip war and any other restrictions on what they can import technologically. So go ahead.
It's meant to be an offer they can't refuse.
Right.
It is a
very much.
And the phrase decisive strategic advantage is, increasingly being bandied about. That's like the idea that by advancing our own AI capabilities and through sort of a combination of means, holding theirs down, we'll get to this point where it's like, okay, look, we can definitely beat you in a war if it comes to that. Therefore, you have basically no choice but to accept the deal, whatever the terms of that deal ultimately are. And those are not specified by anyone, really, as far as I know. This is all projected to happen in the not too distant future. Dario's timelines for AGI, or he prefers the term powerful AI, are like 2 to 4 years. He's like 27 is kind of the 28 maybe, but 27 I think is kind of his most likely year for when this stuff really starts to happen. That was, by the way, the year that we played in the war game simulation over the weekend. And, that means it's probably current leadership that's intended to, that's imagined to be the ones doing this, right? It's
I'm
Trump
feeling better already.
Side,
I'm feeling better already.
Yeah. So we've got Trump and Xi, and these are the two, relatively singular figures on both sides that this scenario flows through in a really core way. So, yeah, I think that is concerning. I don't like the plan very much either. There isn't much of an alternative that I can find, and I don't feel like I have the answers. As to why
I have one, but we'll get around.
Yeah, well, I want to hear it.
It's vague, unfortunately, but
it is tough. That, as Zvi Mashwitz recently said in a conversation I had with him, all the options are bad. So I think it is tough. I don't want to pretend that there are easy solutions, and I don't want to suggest that we should just be totally naive with respect to the Chinese government. I don't think that's a recipe for success either. But I really don't know how this happened. I'm certainly not a scholar of the blob, the foreign policy establishment. All that kind of stuff is a little bit outside my wheelhouse.
I will handle the vehement denunciations of the foreign policy establishment. You don't have to worry about that. Go ahead.
One theory I've heard is that it's the only way to get things done in Washington in this moment. Obviously we've got polarization, and the parties are sort of inclined to block each other and try to prevent the other side from getting wins wherever possible. One notable change is that dynamic may have been put aside for the moment, where the Republicans are going to be able to do what they want to do, it seems, especially if they're willing to break a few more norms, which recent history suggests that they probably will be willing to do if needed. But up until this last election, there's been enough kind of a stalemate that how else do you get anything done? The sense has been, from what I gather, again, not spending any time in DC and certainly not being a DC insider, the sense has been, we can't let the other side have a win, but we can both kind of agree that we should do stuff to get an edge on China. So there's been willingness to put money into that and try to bring. Can
you elaborate on that a little? So you're saying there's certain parts of the policy agenda that aren't necessarily central to the China question that they want to get some leverage on in Washington, and by signing on to the China consensus that helps, or what? And if so, what are those policy items?
Yeah, I mean, again, take this with a major grain of salt, because I'm definitely kind of relaying what I've heard, not what I've experienced. But the idea is basically, if you want to get something going in Washington, you got to find a way to frame it as a way to get ahead vis-a-vis China. And, our bridges are falling down, our roads are falling apart. China's got better stuff. We can't let that happen, and then you kind of play that out across everything. In some cases, I do think for the better. We obviously are dependent on international supply chains. And I have mixed feelings about this, because I do think broad decoupling from China makes future conflict easier and more likely, and I don't like that. So I actually do want to see the continuation of economic coupling with China. At the same time, I think it's only somewhat prudent to say the fact that we can't make any advanced chips domestically is like a state not really to be endured. So when we put some subsidies into bringing chip manufacturing back into the United States physical territory, I think that's that at least shows that somebody has some lights on in Washington. And I think that's good. But there's a lot of other things where, it's my sense is, impression from afar is that people feel like the anti-China train is the one train that's moving. And if you want to, get your thing moving, you kind of have to figure out a way to get it on that train, and everything else is kind of stuck.
Yeah. Well, I will say, in support of that thesis, kind of, is that, there's an earlier landmark before the Dario essay here, and it's the Leopold Aschenbrenner essay, Situational Awareness. And that wound up, and we can talk about that, but it's the same. Well, I should say, here I should flesh out what I think is the scenario that's common in these circles, and you can tell me if it's wrong. By these circles, I mean the AI side of the China hawkism, not the traditional foreign policy side necessarily. But you saw this in the Aschenbrenner essay. I think you see it in the Dario essay. And first of all, let me say the Aschenbrenner essay was retweeted by no less a personage than Ivanka Trump. So, yeah, it got in the conversation. I don't know how many Twitter followers she had, but that was noted, right? And separate from that, Trump, a number of people in Silicon Valley had Trump's ear by virtue of donations and so on. But anyway, the scenario in that essay is that once you get to this sometimes vaguely defined thing called artificial general intelligence, you're approaching a kind of takeoff point in the evolution of artificial intelligence, and suddenly you're in superintelligence realm, and that gives you such an, things move so fast that if you get to this threshold first, then a few months later, you have utter dominance over all rivals. And we're not talking mainly about weaponry here, as I understand it, although it may involve that. As I understand it, they're saying, you can just say to the AI, go find a way to infiltrate China's social media and convince them that their government sucks, right? I think people are imagining a future where the AI is that smart and responds to directives that broad. I just thought that up myself. I haven't seen it, but I assume that's the kind of thing they're talking about. And so the Aschenbrenner essay, and I hope we'll have time to get around to saying some things about that, because like the Dario essay, the Dario essay, in its defense, that part of it was short. He didn't have time to do a whole argument. The Aschenbrenner argument, the whole essay is about, in effect, why we should be China hawks.
And it's not short.
It's not short, and yet I see fundamental assumptions behind that not being addressed or even stated. And I hope we'll get around to that. But tell me, is this is one reason the China hawkism is caught on in the AI circles is because among a lot of people, that view was already instantiated. The idea that, there will be this threshold. Beyond that, you get an intelligence explosion. Obviously, whoever gets there first is going to be in charge. That's kind of widely assumed in certain circles.
I would say everything is pretty highly uncertain. That the event that you alluded to where this war game simulation took place was designed to be kind of a mixing bowl, like a meeting of different camps or tribes. The AI safety tribe, if you will, was one contingent. But there was definitely also a sort of national security persona that was there. And there were people on definitely, I joked earlier today, very fine people on both sides of important questions, like just how good or powerful, I should say, is AI going to get, how quickly, if it does get really powerful, how likely are we going to be to control it? And then, downstream of that, what should we do with it? So I wouldn't say there was any single worldview that dominated, but as Leopold said in his original tweet with the situational awareness thing, it's not that people necessarily think it's for sure going to happen, but everybody agrees it's kind of strikingly plausible. We look back at just the last few years where I remember reading about GPT-2 when my now 5-year-old son was just about to be born. I was at the hospital, my wife was getting checked in, I was in the waiting room and just kind of nervously scrolling, and there's GPT-2. This thing could not do much of anything. It could barely put together a coherent paragraph. It certainly wasn't useful. And now we have expert level reasoning across, all domains of knowledge, at least for routine tasks. We've talked about that in the past. Like the difference between routine tasks and, truly novel work. And the AIs aren't quite doing that yet. But everybody's kind of looking at the trend and saying, this really can't continue much longer without crossing some really important thresholds. And so everybody at least takes that possibility seriously. I wouldn't say anybody at the event was dismissing that possibility. Some feel like it's overwhelmingly likely. Others feel like it's unlikely, but can't be dismissed. And that range of opinions still, kind of forces everybody to think, what do we do if that is in fact the scenario? I still don't know why we jump, in the AI, especially in the more AI safety community. And again, I don't have like polling data to back this up, but my subjective impression is that most people across these personality types, and there's, a lot of disagreement about a lot of things, but it seemed to me that pretty significant, I would even say large majorities of both the AI safety and the sort of national security, that range of personas, it seemed like a large majority across the board seem to support the export controls, aka chip ban or chip war, as you've called it, against China. And I don't really know why that immediately follows. It does seem to me like a pretty narrow, especially in the time available, right? I mean, the scenario that we played, and I think this is even more speculative. I think most people probably at that event expect that AI will continue to progress. We will probably see things like what it would have sometimes called the drop-in knowledge worker, that an AI can kind of take over a computer and do useful work like, most people who work at a computer do on a daily basis throughout the economy. That level of AI is, I would say, pretty broadly expected. There's a lot less agreement as to when you get there, how fast does that turn into super intelligence? And, a lot of arguments, a lot of kind of, well, geez, when the AIs can write AI, optimization code, and when they can explore new architectures for themselves as well, or maybe a little better than we can do that, and a lot faster, because of course, if you have one AI researcher, you have potentially 1 million copies of an AI researcher that can explore the space of AI architectures all in parallel.
Yeah.
Does that mean we take off?
We should say probably for kind of lay people, which is a lot of people in my podcast audience, the assumption here, the term singularity, which you may have heard, refers sometimes to technological acceleration generally, but in particular to the point where the AI starts improving itself. In a certain sense, it already is. It's facilitating coding. It's making coding more efficient. But as that gets more, as the feedback cycle gets more and more direct, like the AI just saying, I'll create a better version of myself. This is the point of takeoff people are referring to. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and how fast that happens, or if it happens, I would say, again, a pretty wide range of opinions. You have some folks who think that a superintelligence follows very quickly after a general intelligence because of these sort of self-optimization loops. Others, and I would put Dario in this camp based on his essay, would say, well, yes, progress will speed up, but it won't be like a super sudden jump because you still got to run a lot of experiments. He talks a lot about the biology experiments, but even the compute experiments, that we do have some limitations on how many AI training runs you can run. Even if you have an AI coming up with a ton of ideas, it is still somewhat of an empirical science as to which of those new architectures are going to work better or worse. We don't really know until we run training. And for training, you need servers, you need GPUs. We only have so many of those. So maybe that sort of puts at least a governing limit on how fast things could go. And then other people think, well, we're just going to hit some sort of a plateau because, and I think this is a little bit fuzzy, but like all we have is human level data. What data are they going to learn from next? I don't tend to think that's the case because I tend to think there's a lot of sort of just feedback from reality that they can start to get. The path of training the AIs it's kind of looping back to like an earlier era where if you go back to sort of mid-teens breakthroughs in AI, a lot of it was game playing AI for different kinds of games. AlphaGo was, of course, a major breakthrough. But there were a bunch, right? There was an AI that could play StarCraft. There was an AI that could play, all these kind of different games. There was one AI that could play lots of different games. And sometimes they didn't even have to teach the AI the rules of the game, meaning like literally just put it in an environment, let it play. It would kind of figure out the rules. It would become superhuman at all these games. And it did that by getting feedback from reality, not by training on internet data, not by training even necessarily on human games played, not even by, training on human feedback, but literally just, did I win the game? Did I lose the game? If I won the game, then I should do more like that. If I lost the game, that wasn't so good. And that signal alone was enough to get these things to superhuman playing levels. Since then, the paradigm has shifted where it's like all the GPTs, they learn from us in a very literal sense, both from reading our internet writings and from reinforcement learning from human feedback, where literally a human is like, I like this response more than this response, or, this seems better than this. But now we're also kind of starting to see, I think this is well underway, but, the future seems to be learning from actual contact with reality, predicting what experiment is going to be worth running, actually running the experiment, getting the result of that, and then tweaking and optimizing to be better at figuring out what experiments to run. Or code, right? That's another one where when you generate code, you can run the code very quickly often. If it errors, you'll see that instantly, right? If it works and it produces what you expect it to produce, you can see that instantly too. So these signals are becoming, I think, or I expect that all these different signals are probably enough to take the current crop of GPTs into like superhuman coding, superhuman experimental design, superhuman hypothesis generation, just like they've previously achieved superhuman game playing across a wide range of games. And so I kind of find it hard to imagine that they don't become superhuman. But again, going back to the range of opinion, not everybody buys that argument.
Yeah, and can I add, kind of inject a question. We'll get back to the China question per se, but the context for this is partly just over the last few weeks, there's been a lot of publicity about is AI hitting a wall. In other words, are the scaling laws reaching a point of diminishing return? And scaling laws refer both to like amount of text you feed into it. And as you just mentioned, there's only so much human generated text. You can generate it with AI and try that, blah, blah, blah. There's issues. And then computing power is another place where, will scaling per se continue to bring the traditional rewards? There are questions about that. I personally, although I know a lot less about this than you, I agree that there are just so many other dimensions along which progress can happen. I mean, OpenAI released this so-called chain of thought model. By the way, speaking of game playing, I kind of wonder if we shouldn't spend much time on this at all, but I kind of wonder if one way of depicting what's going on in there is the machine has a conversation with itself. It's as if there were two LLMs in there. And so like, hey, what about this? And then the other part of the machine's self, which might as well be another LLM, says, I don't know, that doesn't make sense for this, blah, blah, blah. Is there a certain amount of, just quickly, is there a certain amount of that kind of internal dialogue that has a little bit in common with the kind of self-play that led to progress in the realm of games, or is this a nutty intuition?
I think it's directionally right. Your description of the chain of thought, I think, is pretty apt. Notably, OpenAI is not sharing that chain of thought with users anymore.
Although there's now an open source Chinese model that says they do it.
And I have gone and used that, and I think it's a striking fast follow. Only like 9 weeks, I think, from the time that the O1 model was announced and given to the public to the time that the Chinese company DeepSeek came out with their DeepThink. And actually, I think there's another one too, another reproduction out of China that's like, so I think
are you suspicious? Are you suspicious of how they, I assume OpenAI is wondering whether they should tighten their security.
Yeah, that's a hard one. Yeah. My best guess is that I think Chinese researchers in general, there's a lot of them. They're very smart. There's a lot of good research coming out of China. This has been true for years. And I hazard, it would be hard to guess. I think you can't rule out that there was some intellectual property theft, but I also would not dismiss at all the possibility, which I guess in my gut is probably the more likely scenario, that they're just good, that they really just have good researchers who are not far behind. And probably were already working on this path. The timelines are very unclear because we heard roughly a year ago now, this was a year ago. We're coming up on I think we've actually just passed the anniversary of the Sam Altman board coup and, restoration and what did Ilya see, right? All this sort of, and the rumor at the time, which I think is increasingly like the consensus understanding of what happened, was that there was some breakthrough in reasoning, and people started to feel, including Ilya Sutskever, hopefully I'm saying that correctly, who was chief scientist and kind of, one of the leading visionaries and one of the, big believers in scaling laws, along with Dario for years. He for a moment kind of flipped and said, we need to take a different approach, and Sam's not the right guy to lead this company because we're really starting to get close to some sort of, transformative AI.
So this is taken seriously within AI circles? Because I've seen the "what did Ilya see" meme, and I just thought just sheer conjecture. Who knows? It's an obviously appealing scenario. It's the kind of thing that would spread virally. But is this is taken seriously among? Because I had heard a whole different story that I won't bother you with, but this is taken seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I think the details, of course, are quite fuzzy, but my general sense is there was, an early demonstration of some new reasoning capability, and they had published about this research. They had, there was an early kind of demonstration where they were starting to do, what is the signal from which the AI learns is, one really key part to the overall story of where the progress is coming from. They had put out a paper in 2023 about rewarding reasoning. I forget exactly what the name of that paper was, but it was sort of, instead of just rewarding on the final answer, looking at each logical step that the AI was taking to try to come up with an answer and giving reward at each one of these steps. So there was already reason to believe that sort of thing was happening. Then there's a guy from that had previously been at Meta who had done incredible work on some of these game playing reinforcement systems. He had been responsible for the AIs that beat humans at No Limit Hold'em poker and also at diplomacy, which was one of those moments, where for anyone who's hasn't played the game of diplomacy, and I'm not a big diplomacy player by any means, it's a game of social dynamics. It's like a European theater and all the countries are trying to jockey for power, but it's not like rolling the dice. Instead, it's about who believes who and who betrays who. And they got an AI to play that at like a very competitive level. So this guy went over from Meta to OpenAI to work on reasoning. So there's all these reasons to believe that there was
my intuition does have a little
happening.
Something to be said for it. If like a game playing guy went over and you think that helped the reasoning project, but
yeah, I mean, I think been pretty open that that's what he's working on.
Yeah.
So I think there was some early demonstration. I think Ilya, my theory, again, these details could be wrong, but I think the generally accepted story is not so much because this thing like totally changed his worldview, but more like, hey, it's really starting to get real now. And there's also been these leaked emails that have since come out just recently where, because of, I guess, court filings and discovery, emails going back to like early OpenAI days when Elon was still there and Sam and Greg and Ilya, all these guys were going back and forth on, can this be a nonprofit? Well, we're going to need so much capital. What should we do? Blah, blah, blah. There was already like not a super high level of trust, even dating back years. And this is in like plain text now in these emails where people are saying like, Sam, we don't really feel like we understand you and we need to understand you better if we're going to go, on this long journey with you. I think some of that was already latent. It started to feel like, hey, this is getting really real. Ilya kind of freaked out, perhaps rightly, perhaps, ultimately futilely, it seems. And then it took them a full year to productize and red team, because they did do a lot of advanced safety testing on this. I had 2 episodes with 2 different external groups that had early access to the new O1 model and ran all kinds of tests on it. And it wasn't just those 2 groups, but those were the 2 that I talked to when it came out.
Yeah, I remember that. That was a good podcast. I recommend it.
Circling back to China, with all those signals in mind, right, it would be very surprising if there weren't groups in China kind of saying,
Yeah.
What's
Yeah.
that? What's down that path, right? Sounds like there's
Right.
something there. We should be working on that too. And yeah, it's possible that, somebody stole the weights or the secrets from OpenAI, but I think there was enough of existence proofs are really powerful in AI. When somebody sees that something is possible, it's a really, it's really powerful signal and kind of invitation to figure out how it happened. And even if this wasn't fully an existence proof in the public view, there was enough kind of consensus understanding that this is kind of what the next big thing is, that I have no doubt that they were working on it before. Possibly when they saw the limited, demonstration and the limited examples of the chain of thought that OpenAI published, they, got a better idea and were able to kind of lock in, this is the exact strategy that we want to use. Notably, I think their thing is still not as good. The O1 model from OpenAI, as far as I understand, on the benchmarks is still a cut above. I would also bet that it is outside of the benchmarks, probably even more of a cut above. I do think OpenAI does generally a really good job on kind of not just looking at these like very discrete tests,
right,
but also, taking a holistic approach.
Yeah, there's a tendency to teach to the test. I mean, there's an incentive to teach to the test when you're training your models. And you're saying OpenAI doesn't seem to do a whole lot of that. Can I the Ilya Ilya Sutskever, an alternative pronunciation that may also be wrong. He gives us a good chance to get back into the kind of China hawk conversation. He said something a couple of years ago. I wish I had the quote in front of me, but it was to the effect of, "My hope is that the world's peoples or the world's nations or something will recognize that this technology," and I don't know if he used the word threat. He obviously sees a great upside to it. But the idea was, my hope is that they will understand with sufficient clarity that it imposes a common challenge to all of them, that it is in their interest to get together and confront it and govern it together. He may not have used those words at all, but that's very much in the spirit of what he said. And one thing that bothers me about the China hawk discourse is I don't see many people bothering to stop and assess whether that belief is true, right? Because if it is, right, if in other words, they don't look at the costs of this like manic AI arms race with China, which just fundamentally affects the psychology of the relationship, radically reduces transparency in certain respects, and just generates this kind of chaotic environment where people are going to feel more compelled to create models, perhaps without adequate safety tests. It just seems to me pretty obvious that if you take certain kinds of threats seriously, and there's a whole range of threats you can take. And by the way, I think not enough attention is paid to the threat of sheer destabilization. In other words, even if the sci-fi doomer scenarios aren't valid, and I don't personally rule them out, but even if they're not, if you look at all the economic and social effects that AI is already starting to have, and many more of which will materialize, it's obviously going to be disruptive, not only in the good sense of the word, it's going to be destabilizing. And when you sign on to what you're describing as an existential arms race, you're saying, let's hasten that. Let's accelerate the destabilization of, I would say, American society. And by the way, one surprise for people may be that China, because of its authoritarian character, actually has more of an interest in regulating the AI and not proceeding too fast, and winds up as a more stable society than the U.S. and beats us that way. That to me is something I'd put in parentheses. It's not like my big concern, but I would say that there are a lot of possible downsides to a big AI arms race with China, and I just don't see these people exploring them. And let me, I'll close. I'll stop and let you talk, but I want to focus on a very specific thing that's been kind of driving me a little crazy, or the lack of discussion of it has. And I want to ask you whether in AI circles this is commonly discussed, because it's one of the most straightforward downsides of the Biden chip war, which, if people don't know by now, consists of not just prohibiting the manufacture, the import of from American companies of certain kinds of things to China, but using American leverage to, to get other Western makers of both chips and equipment to not send, to deprive China both of the high performance chips that they were getting not long ago, and of the equipment needed to make them. So here's the scenario where I think this is obviously a dangerous policy. And I think I've seen you allude to a version of it, but I want to be clear about the version I'm talking about. So as of a few years ago, both China and the West were getting high performance AI level chips out of the factories in Taiwan that are run by TSMC. And that, when you think about it, was a disincentive for China to invade. Whatever other incentives they may have, it's pretty clear that if they invade Taiwan, those factories are going to be incapacitated in one way or another. Probably if the U.S. loses the war, they're going to bomb them on the way out. But if not, because of their ongoing reliance on like the Dutch company that makes the most high performance manufacturing equipment, you can in effect pull the plug remotely by ceasing to provide support. So, either the U.S. wins the war, and China wants to. Anyway, the point is, it was kind of a mutually assured destruction thing. War in Taiwan means one way or another, one side is going to just as soon see the factories incapacitated. So war means both sides lose their access to the high-performance AI chips. That's what we had as of a few years ago, a kind of mutually assured destruction, a reason neither country wants war. Now, we have created a situation where China is no longer getting the high-performance chips. So whatever disincentive existed for China to invade, that has definitely been lessened. And I'm not, I want to distinguish this from this scenario where China just says, well, screw it, we're going to blow up these factories. That could happen too. But what I'm talking about is something I think more plausible, where China, which obviously has this set of reasons it wants to bring Taiwan back into its country, because it, of course, considers it a renegade province. And in fact, it's not even recognized by us as a sovereign nation. So I'm talking about a subtler dynamic where China's just doing these calculations every year. And they're like, well, the U.S. is sending more weapons. It's not going to get any easier. And by the way, we care a lot less now whether this factory gets blown up. And because the chip war has gotten us to accelerate the development of our indigenous chip-making capacity, we may do better pretty soon than the West does in terms of hanging on to like the next level of chips, like smartphone chips. So this is so clear-cut. It's just game theoretical. Like, you can't argue with the game theory here. And yet I have had people do it on my podcast, but I finally found somebody who had actually written about it, named Paul Triolo. I'd encourage you to have him on the podcast. He's a real expert on Chinese tech. My question to you is, do you hear this in AI circles? Because I do not hear it in the foreign policy establishment. And that itself is a very bad sign. Jake Sullivan and the Biden administration, with the encouragement of some people in tech like Eric Schmidt, did this policy. I see no signs that they actually thought it through. And you would definitely hear about the scenario I just laid out if they had thought it, if people were talking robustly about this policy. Do you hear much about this?
At least a little, I guess is the silver lining sort of good news, but definitely not as much as the mainline scenario. And I don't mean to suggest I think it's the most likely scenario, but the scenario that is talked about most is definitely, hold them down, we move forward, we try to create this advantage, we've covered that. You do hear, I think, all of the things that you mentioned. I don't think we're entirely alone in, playing out those scenarios in our heads and worrying about them. But it does seem to be a minority. I think the prevailing view is more like, The timelines are probably fairly short timelines, of course, in AI discourse. How soon does powerful AI arrive? People think that, probably not that long, maybe as soon, literally people are saying like maybe as soon as 2025, maybe literally next year, maybe 2026, most likely 2027, 2028, a little less likely. Hard to imagine it doesn't arrive by like end of 2030. That's I would say that's the general consensus view. If you don't subscribe to that, you're somewhat of a minority. And that doesn't mean that there's also this sense that like, if it goes past 2030, then it could be a while longer, because then that would mean there's something we don't understand. So people are sort of like, unless I'm like wrong in terms of how I understand the situation, it's coming soon. But I could be totally wrong, and then kind of who knows.
I would just interject, tell me when I get too obnoxious about this, but that if China shares that view, that heightens their incentive to invade Taiwan. They want to stop our access to the high-performance chips, and there is no other source outside of Taiwan right now, ASAP, if they share your view. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I had a good discussion with Zvi Mashowitz about this recently, and he put it very plainly, just saying, if the Chinese government believed what you, like Western, AI leaders and policymakers believe about the timeline to AGI or powerful AI or transformative AI, whatever you want to call it, if they believed that, why would TSMC still be there? They could easily destroy the manufacturing capacity. I don't know if they could effectively or successfully invade if it came to that, but these manufacturing processes are extremely delicate. The machinery, we're talking, limited quantity supply from this Dutch company, ASML, that makes the machines that make the chips. They're hundreds of millions of dollars. They're packed in, extremely, delicate packaging to make the trip to Taiwan. Teams from ASML go to TSMC and are on site with them there to, operate them effectively. Because this is not simple stuff. It's not like, just stamping press that's stamping things out. There's a lot of little intricacies, and I'm not an expert in it, but I understand that almost nobody is really an expert in the high level view. When you drill down, it's like all of these steps in the process, and there are many, many steps, are all highly optimized with experts that, spend years and years of their career just becoming, the world's leading expert on one little part of this overall supply chain. To go, they say like a speck of dust can ruin a chip. People go in and sort of clean room type.
Them. Yeah. I would say in response to what he said, there are many downsides to China invading. I mean, there would be just a boatload of sanctions. Their economy's already in trouble. There's a lot of geopolitical reasons they would be very hesitant to do it. And I guess, in a way, this gets at one thing that I'm worried about. It's like I said, I haven't heard this game theory in the foreign policy establishment, and I kind of keep track of their journals. And on the other hand, your crowd, like the AI Silicon Valley crowd, they're very rationalist and game theoretical in their approach, but they are less versed in the broader geopolitical stuff. Like I didn't sense in, for example, the Aschenbrenner essay, the texture of conversancy in international affairs that I'd like to see from somebody who's recommending that we do something that may get the world blown up. But anyway, I digress.
I mean, there are voices, and there certainly, again, this stuff does come up. I would, agree that I don't think the depth of expertise is there in the AI space as you would like. One person I would recommend folks follow is Miles Brundage.
Oh, yeah.
He recently left OpenAI, where he was, I believe his title was head of policy research. And he's increasingly, I think he's kind of, figuring out what he's going to do next, and in theory, taking a little vacation, although he's still saying quite a bit online. But one of the things that he said that has caught my attention the most is the West needs to figure out ways to demonstrate to China that our AI development is benign. And unfortunately, obviously that would be a lot easier to do if it actually were benign. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that it really is benign, certainly from like a Chinese government's perspective. when you have the president of the United States saying in print that we need to win the AI arms race with China, that leaves little room for interpretation from them in terms
of...
Was
that Biden or Trump?
No, that Trump in a recent, press release. And then you also have, the AI lab leaders saying the same thing. We've covered Dario. Sam Altman has also radically changed tunes on this over the last few years. I'm old enough to remember when he used to say that we shouldn't make our AI decisions based on what we think China might do. There's video of this. And on previous podcasts, I've specifically called out, look, I think that's great, because I used to say he could very easily make China the bogeyman, and that would create more rationale for him to do whatever he wants to do. Well, sure enough, that's now flipped, and he's put out an op-ed several months ago, deeper into the past now than the Dario essay, but basically saying the same thing. The kind of key point was, this is Sam Altman's op-ed, paraphrased lightly, it's either AI with Western values or it's AI with autocratic values. There's no third way. And yikes, that you've got kind of all these data points I think are going to be hard for the Chinese government to see as anything other than a threat to the regime. I mean, it's like, when the stated plan is back them into a corner and make them an offer they can't refuse, terms unspecified, I think that's going to be pretty hard for them to accept. Now, Zvi said, and I think this is good analysis from him, he said, why is TSMC still there? All the disincentives that you mentioned are, of course, very real, right? Lighting the fuse now would come at huge cost. Lighting the fuse at any point will come at huge cost. But if they were to, destroy TSMC now, that would definitely come at huge cost for the global economy. We can't make cars in today's world without a supply of chips. So it's not, I think there are I'm not an expert in this, so
it's amazing
you should
how
fact
many
check
chips.
me, but I've heard thousands of chips in a single car. So, it's not just like you can't make the AI, can't make AGI without the chips. You can't really make much of anything without the chips these days. So that would be a huge
many of those are low performance chips, but
and there are some other sources, but still a lot. I mean, my understanding is a lot of the volume, even of stuff that isn't like the very most cutting edge, does still come out of Taiwan. And there's, stuff in Korea and there's stuff in other places, and we're trying to build our own, factories obviously here too. But Zvi's analysis, which I thought was good, was the reason TSMC is still there is they don't believe it in their gut at this point. They don't believe that this takeoff is necessarily happening. And, the implication of that, though, is if they do come to believe it, then they pretty plausibly would act differently.
Well, then they're only, I think, just starting to digest probably the growing consensus. I mean, the Dario thing only came out 2 months ago. I assume they paid attention to that. This whole idea, I mean, when the Aschenbrenner thing first came out, it's like you look at this guy, he looks like he's about 20, and like, okay, great, people are talking about it, but I suspect China's just starting to take very seriously the idea that this could be the strategy. We get this stranglehold on their technology, and then when we get utter supremacy after the intelligence explosion, we demand that they submit in the sense of signing on. And, the Dario essay is alarmingly vague on what we would want them to do. I mean, I really want to quote some of this because I find it so frustrating. Let me see. I'm just calling up the piece I wrote in Nonzero. So he says the coalition would aim to gain the support of more and more of the world, isolating our worst adversaries and eventually putting them in a position, this is a coalition of democracies, where they are better off taking the same bargain as the rest of the world. Give up competing with democracies in order to receive all the benefits and not fight a superior foe. I'm curious, what does he mean by give up competing with democracies? He doesn't tell us. And it's like, and see, I want to ask you about this. This gets to something I want to ask about. I mean, seems like they should be allowed to compete in some ways, like economically and so on. So I assume I think he's buying into an assumption that's also common in the foreign policy establishment, which I would like to question, and this could explain why China hawkism is pretty popular in Silicon Valley, because there's a lot of libertarians there. And I can imagine how they would think, well, if China wins the race for global supremacy, their values get imposed on us and we will not have freedom. Could happen, but if that scenario depends on a particular assumption, I'd like to question the assumption. And that is the assumption that, just kind of broadly speaking, part of China's foreign policy is a desire to impose their form of governments on other countries. That is commonly assumed. There is no evidence of it. It's misleading, because the more we sanction a bunch of like authoritarian or autocratic countries, the more they get together. And so it looks like this monolithic threat. And of course, they try to recruit countries to their side. But as a rule, they don't like ask them to become authoritarian or autocratic. They just allow them, they just want them to be part of their economic zone and vote their way in international institutions. And I think to some extent, you know, China has, if anything, been notable for its realpolitik. In other words, like, we'll do business with anybody. We're not trying to turn you into a model of ourselves. We are hard-nosed business people, and we want to do transactions with you, economic, national security, whatever, but we're not trying to turn you into China. And I think to some extent, America is projecting its own foreign policy on China. We do try to turn countries into models of ourselves. In many ways, it's laudable. Many of the human rights we lobby for, you know, I share those values, even though I think it's, you know, the effects range from none to counterproductive as a practical matter. If you look at like the sanctions we impose, still, I prefer our form of governance. But the fact is, we do want to impose it on the world. We do want, you know, whether violently in Iraq or whatever, that's our game. And there's just no good evidence that it's China's game. And I'm wondering if you think that assumption, I mean, it doesn't have to figure in to an Aschenbrenner scenario, but I'm wondering if you think the assumption that China really wants to, and by the way, I can see how, you know, you'd see like when China tries to punish Hollywood studios that or subsidize them to do the 9- line on its maps or 12- whatever it is. I understand how you think, wow, they're getting in our system. That's true. But I do think there are explanations of that other than their goal is for us to become authoritarian. So I've talked a long time, but I'm curious, do you think that the view I'm describing is common in kind of Silicon Valley circles?
Yes, I think so. Maybe a little less confident in this than elsewhere, but I did feel this weekend a little bit that it does seem like kind of a hall of mirrors sort of projection, you know, or sort of a game theory prisoner's dilemma type dynamic where, you know, it's not just at this point that people are thinking that they want to impose their values on us, but that we're thinking that they're going to think that we are going to hold them down, and so they're going to be, you know, an adversarial approach to us is baked into their, you know, analysis, and so
there's another way to attack the perception that we're trying to hold them down. By the way, like don't do chip
again,
wars.
It would be much better if it really were benign, you know. So yeah, that's my view is always. I mean, people. Joshua Steinman, who I recently did a podcast of, which I honestly don't really recommend that much because I didn't think it was super productive. But I ran it anyway because he is a 4-year member of the Trump National Security Council from the first term. And so I thought, you know, even though I didn't think we had a very good meeting of the minds necessarily in our hour and change together.
No, you didn't. I can confirm that.
I still think it is worth, you know, considering what he and, you know, presumably others think. He called this the physics of the environment that we're in, which is, you know, I think obviously an overstatement in that there is no physical law that says that we can't break out of this prisoner's dilemma dynamic. But it is, I have now, you know, heard multiple layers, you know, it's sort of an infinite regress, right? Of like, we don't trust them, so we're doing this. we believe that they're not going to trust us because we're doing this. Therefore, they're going to act this way. Therefore, we got to bake that into our expectations. And at some point, it does just kind of take on, a life of its own. And I do think we should challenge that. I mean, of course, there are some things that are trying to challenge that, and there are some signs of hope. I'd be remiss not to celebrate the Xi and Biden joint statement that we will not put AI in the nuclear chain of command. That seems, like the absolute minimum that we could hope for from sensible leadership. But it's good. Let's still celebrate it as a positive step. And there are AI safety groups in China. They don't have like an official one that is sort of there. The UK and the US and some other countries now have established an official AI safety institute at a national level. These groups are like setting standards or trying to, and coming up with sort of ways to evaluate how dangerous new AIs are, and they're trying to coordinate at an international level. China has like some of these sort of organizations. They don't necessarily have one that's like the official, designated group to go out and talk to the world, but they do have people domestically that are concerned, with AI safety in the grandest sense. There's even some talk that like maybe Xi is a doomer. That's kind of a sort of underground meme in the AI world that, he's said a few things that, everybody's, unfortunately, we're reading the tea leaves and kind of psychologizing literally Trump and Xi, right? I mean, that's what it's come to. But people do have at least somewhat of a theory that, hey, maybe Xi is actually, going to be the real, he's a scientist, right? So maybe he'll be the one that kind of sees this clearly and tries to, to de-escalate the situation. And one can hope, one also could hope that Trump could pull some sort of Nixon goes to China kind of deal. That was definitely discussed this weekend. Because I asked, there was one guy who presented, this was under Chatham House rules, but I don't think it's too much to say that this was a person who was a previous member of the national security establishment, right? So that narrows it down to millions of possible people. Basically giving a presentation around, where do we go from, where are we and where do we go from here? And, it was everything that we've just discussed, right? That basically the path is going to be militarization, closer partnership between the government and the leading companies in the United States, definitely like onshoring all of the production that we possibly can, trying to create this advantage, trying to hold China down through, any and all means necessary, definitely including the supply of chip restrictions and kind of whatever else, we might need to do. Right now, like the margin on this sort of thing is and of course they're finding ways to get around the ban in some cases, right? So there's a black market too. But even there is analysis that like, hey, if we do cut them off, they're definitely going to develop their own industry. And that, means we don't have leverage in the future. So how can we, while trying to cut them off, how can we sort of soften that so that we don't create so much incentive? Right now, it is possible for Chinese companies to buy high levels of compute from US suppliers, from, like an AWS data center in Singapore, for example. You can, as a Chinese company, you can go and buy there. But that is kind of the margin now of like, well, maybe that also will need to be restricted because if they can buy that, then they can still train, advanced models and whatever. So at some point in this presentation, I kind of raised my hand and said, what do you think China's going to do? This has all been from our perspective. Do you have a theory of how they're going to respond? And, I give the guy credit for being very candid about it. He was basically like, I don't have a good answer for you, but his sort of the most hopeful thing that he could come up with was Trump likes to make deals. Maybe at some point over the next couple of years, Trump finds an opportunity to make a deal and kind of cuts China in to the deal in some way. And, can we do that in a way that where there's enough trust, where, there's, enough ability to save face on all sides? I think that's going to be very difficult, but, that sort of escalate to de-escalate path, we always hope for the de-escalation, or at least I do. And, maybe, but it does feel right now like there's not a coherent story of how all this plays out in a way that doesn't lead to, at a minimum, I've started to say, made is the new mad. Mutual AI destruction is the new mutually assured destruction. I've seen other people say that too. I think I coined it independently.
Except without destabilizing effects, I would say.
Well,
I mean, let me. Can I interrupt you? Because as you know, there's a point we come to in this podcast where we go into what's called overtime. That's available to paid subscribers of Nonzero newsletter, also known as members, whose support we greatly appreciate because we depend on it to keep going. I want to. So we're going to keep talking, but the rest will be available to members. I want to talk about like what would a deal with China look like involving AI. It would be real challenging to even construct a good deal. I think I should say something. I've talked a lot about what's wrong with the current approaches. I feel I should say something about what I think would be a better approach. I will. I want to get you to elaborate on your war game, your futuristic war game, if we have time for all that, and I hope we will. You know, I also want to say, I want to encourage people, first of all, to listen to your podcast. Again, you know, sometimes I hit one, it's just like over my head, it's hopeless, but you know, many of them are quite accessible. So certainly if you're like in the AI, if you're AI conversant, you should definitely check out the Cognitive Revolution podcast. And even if you're a layperson, you should peruse it for conversations that are accessible to you, because many will be. And also I encourage people to check out the Nonzero newsletter, of course. There have been a number of, like I did a piece on Sam Altman not long ago. And I've done a fair amount about AI. The Altman piece was published in the Washington Post. So you should go wherever you can get on the other side of the paywall, I guess. But thanks to everybody who's followed us this far. And Nathan, thank you for, being willing to stick around for this.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Anything you want to say before we jump into overtime?
No, I mean, I don't think so. I think these are the right questions to be asking. You know, that my personal goal is to try to understand AI from all angles. And I kind of wish that I could just, content myself with the technical side. And that's definitely still a big part of what I'm trying to understand and what I'm trying to, help others understand with the podcast. But unfortunately, the geopolitical side is coming on strong and can't be ignored. So I appreciate that you are engaging with this. And I do think we really need more voices to at least question, and it's not to say that we'll see what we can do in the second half, but, I think, Zvi's quote, and people should follow Zvi Moshowitz too, for just,
that guy's got a ridiculous amount of brain power, man. I don't know how he gets it all out.
Yeah, you can get 10,000 words of pretty comprehensive AI analysis a week from his Substack. And, again, the kind of bottom line quote that keeps ringing in my head is, all the options are bad. So I think we're in a tough spot, but I do think we do need more voices to be questioning this. I really appreciate Miles Brundage leaving OpenAI, in part, I think, to be able to speak more frankly about exactly this question. And I appreciate, folks like you coming from a more geopolitical background and trying to engage deeply with the technology too. I think, we're a pretty small minority right now who are questioning I like the term chip war. I usually have said chip ban, but it is more evocative and perhaps more accurate to say chip war.
Oh, so, I suspect they view it as an act of war. It's not, I don't think it's crazy quite to compare it in some respects to the embargo on Japanese oil that, as you may recall, was followed by the bombing of Pearl Harbor. But it's not quite, but, we are saying, like, look, AI is going to be the lifeblood of the economy in the next, within years. And we're saying, and you can't have it, you can't have the advanced one. Anyway, look, I very much appreciate your efforts. By the way, I just made the snap decision to liberate the Sam Altman piece from the paywall. So go to Nonzero, not the Washington Post. They've got Jeff Bezos supporting them. And you don't. And the point is, you're not going to have to pay to read it. There's also this AI surrenders to the military-industrial complex piece. I hope people read. Yeah, check out all relevant content. And now, if it's okay with you, Nathan, we will head into overtime.
Let's do it.